April 17th, or April 7th rather, 10 days ago, the debt went to 14.2642. So it went from 14.21 to $14.26 trillion, oh dear, on April 7th, 2011. Since the beginning of the fiscal year, on October 1st, 2010, the national debt has increased by $653.4 billion. Now, here's a picture of Biden. He was sleeping during Obama's talk on the economy. You'll notice here he wasn't exactly the only one sleeping, leading many to speculate and theorize on the internet that perhaps some sort of mind control, hypnotic trance, or signal or wave was being sent out to the audience, causing people to fall into a stupor and let the programming enter into their subconscious and cerebral cortex. But it's all just speculation. Bill, do we have our guest? Okay, before we get to him, we're going to cover the last report of the evening, and this is from nasa.gov, and the headline is this: solar activity heats up. If you've ever stood in front of a hot stove watching a pot of water and waiting impatiently for it to boil, you know what it feels like to be a solar physicist. Well, NASA's Solar Dynamics Observatory recorded this X-1.5 class solar flare on March 9th, 2011. And what's interesting about this date, March 9th, 2011, is that the earthquake took place the next day in Japan. On 3/11/2011, many of us here in the United States woke up to the news that Japan was hit by a massive earthquake. And so I believe that this is more information, more evidence, fitting into the larger pattern that massive solar flares, in particular X-class solar flares, do cause things to change just a little bit down here on planet Earth. So with that, we're going to spend the next 40 minutes talking with my friend Leon Nagant. He's been on the show several times in 2008, and he has some commentary and perspective on some of the things taking place on the planet. Leon, how are you?
Okay, thanks for having me back.
All right, so where would you like to begin? You've been monitoring this as well. You mentioned some interesting things on the show last time you were on. Where would you like to begin? Kind of introduce yourself to the audience and some of the things that we're going to be talking about.
Okay, yeah, well, for those that don't know me, I'm a professional clairvoyant. I've been doing it since my adolescence. I have training, but I also have it in my genetics to be able to see energy, see spirit. And I've always had unusual dreams, and as my clairvoyance was awakening, these vision dreams started to happen. And I distinctly remember the first one dreaming about watching TV and seeing an earthquake in LA and waking up the next day and thinking it was so real and spending all day searching the news for that earthquake, and yet nothing had happened. And a few months later, that exact earthquake, Northwood earthquake, manifest. I had a vision of Malibu fires. So those kinds of awakenings are kind of what showed me that I was psychic, and then I got training, and then I've been doing it as a professional my entire life. In the late 90s, I had another period of visions about the future, one after another, hundreds actually, and I wrote most of them down, and they showed me a series of events to happen for America, for the world. And it's never been something that works as promotion as a professional clairvoyant. As a professional clairvoyant, I work with people. I help them through their personal crises. I'm a healer. So talking about the end of the world with people, it doesn't really market yourself. So it's not something that I generally like to talk about. It's very personal to me. And I've kept it really close to my heart. In fact, I really have shared most of it as myself on your show. And so recently, especially with the Japanese earthquake and what you mentioned with the increase in solar activity, there's been a series of visions that have shown me that the predictions that I've seen during those 90s visions are really starting to happen. So it's activated me a little bit here.
All right. Where would you like to begin in terms of the visions? For those that don't know, I contacted Leon several years ago because I came across something that he posted on his website. And the word I want to use is synchronicity. A couple years ago, I started encountering this synchronicity more and more of people that have had some of the same dreams, some of the same visions. And Leon, where would you like to begin with this?
Well, I know we've talked, or you've talked a lot about China and upcoming wars and things that are going on, and one of my visions started out with wars. Now, mind you, this was before 9/11, but I had a vision of a nuclear terrorist explosion in New York. Now, we did not have a nuclear terrorist explosion, but there was clearly a massive terrorist explosion that happened in New York that changed the world forever. And in those visions, it showed the war machines waking up, the American war machine waking up, as well as Russian and Chinese war machines waking up. And this period where America would get away with war after war after war after war until they can't get away with that anymore. And so I've watched that unfold. I've been watching Chinese military develop. I've been watching them form alliances with Russia. I've been watching these visions unfold in a very non-dramatic way. It's happening diplomatically. It's not so much of an explosion in your face yet. And so that's definitely one space. Some of these visions that have covered natural disasters have been real simple. I can just go off the list and most of them focus on America. I think that's because I'm American and I live here and I keep my attention on America and staying safe. So I tend to see events like that. So I've seen several earthquakes, 7.0 in the San Francisco Bay Area, followed 3 months later by an 8.0 earthquake. These earthquakes are very crippling. It's not going to help us on the economic levels at all. It's going to make things worse. I've seen other earthquakes, a 6.5 earthquake in New York and a 6.5 in San Diego, and also volcanic eruptions in Seattle. So clearly more volcanic activity. There was one vision where I was actually on an extraterrestrial ship, and these beings were explaining these visions to me and what I was seeing. And they made a point of pointing out the sun and showing the increased solar activity that was occurring during this time when these things would start unfolding. And they were saying quite clearly that solar activity was linked directly to earthquakes on Earth, that those solar flares, when they flow off, they're not just affecting Earth, they do affect all the planets in the solar system. Another reason why I'm kind of alerted to this, and the point that you mentioned of watching a flare hit the Earth and the Japanese earthquake pop off. Japan, I had one very specific vision of that, and it took place over a series of years. And when I started that vision, Japan had already fallen. It had been abandoned by people. You could clearly see, or I could clearly see, homes that had slid off their foundations, villages abandoned, fires off here and there. And I remember seeing Chinese military people on the continent looking for people, securing the area. And I remember watching them being very terrified of what had happened in Japan, and especially while they were checking houses and homes. That vision flashed back to before Japan fell, when it was highly populated, and that's when the earthquakes start coming and start slamming Japan. Now, there would be no way for me, well, maybe, but at the time there would be no way to realize how damaging these earthquakes are. I don't know if I would have believed
Now, Leon,
it.
don't you find it interesting, I know I do, at how for years in Japanese comic books, anime, there has been this plot of a zombie apocalypse that follows some sort of nuclear meltdown of some sort of a plant where the radiation causes people to become zombie-like. That's very startling, given that in our own society, especially in Portland, there is a massive obsession with what is called the zombie apocalypse.
Well, we're all very, very psychic. So, I mean, look at Godzilla. He doesn't breathe fire. He has radioactive breath, and he's born from radiation, and that's been an icon for Japan forever. We're all very psychic. That argument goes from fiction or nonfiction. Nonfiction is written to be based on reality. Fiction is fantasy made up on our heads. But if everyone's psychic, everyone's clairvoyant. People do tap into their clairvoyance, and they might be telling a story, but it's something that they're picking up, that they're sensing. We see that in all forms of media and art and human expression, really.
Yeah, and it manifests itself in language. It's also called the collective unconscious, or the zeitgeist of the ages.
Right.
Well,
right, exactly.
When people discuss China and the future, it provokes a lot of very strong opinions in people. And I've heard many people say the United States will never be invaded by a foreign country. It cannot happen. It will not happen. It is logistically impossible. The reason why I find this to be fascinating, the idea that this could happen, that we're onto something here, is simply looking at every single administration that we've had giving China top secret military technology, missile technology transfers that has happened illegally without approval of Congress for many, many years. And this is a story that both the controlled left and right should be aware of. Now, you don't necessarily see a particular timeline to this, or when or what year it's going to happen, but as I recall from the last interview, you noted that this event that comes to this continent happens after these natural disasters.
Right. I really see it starting with what's happened in Japan. Japan's going to continue to fall apart, and then once America gets hit with a good-sized disaster, especially money-making epicenter like the San Francisco Bay Area just being taken out overnight, and then add a few more on top of it, and the money problem that's gone on. I mean, to me, just clairvoyantly looking at America and the U.S. dollar and its value, it's worthless. It's all a big joke. I mean, everyone's just propping this stuff up, holding back the collapse, but it's really worthless. And one of my predictions is the collapse of the U.S. dollar, where it is worthless, where people will burn it in a fireplace just to get the fire started. And it's the Chinese that come in and reform global currency, and China's currency will be what dominates and takes over American currency. So this happening is part of that. That's always been one big argument why China would never attack America, because they own us, and that's just a ridiculous excuse.
But one of the ideas that could be explored here when we say attack America is the potential that they could be called in to quell civil unrest within the United States when a turbulent situation is already going on internally within our own country. That is to say, the possibility that peacekeepers could be called in or invited into the country to deal with what that which controls our government calls domestic terrorists. But again, I'm just mentioning this as a possibility.
And that's how my visions have shown the Chinese, and that's how they spin it with their propaganda to promote themselves to the rest of the world. They are peacekeepers. They are coming in to bring order to chaos. But the definition of that can get really out of whack. They may have to do that in Japan. I definitely see them in there, and they may have to do that here. But some of those arguments are also about American wealth. Russia gets involved here, and it's about Americans hoarding wealth and keeping it from the rest of the world while most of the world's population goes without food, water, and shelter.
Right.
You have America, who's the wealthiest country, keeping it all, bankrupting it, throwing everything into chaos. That becomes a major issue, and also America's war history of just constant war after another. So part of peacekeeping is stopping the Americans from what they're doing, raping the earth. So that can start out with really good intentions. Oh, we're here to help. But the argument can get really quite out of whack.
Right, and there are some people that would welcome the Chinese, believing that is a better system. For those that are watching this show that are hearing this for the very first time, this idea that this could happen, there is some information, some data, some facts that you can look up while the web is still up and operational. Take a look at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is the alliance between China and Russia, where the common enemy is the United States. Also take a look at Idaho, at the governor, Butch Otter, welcoming the Chinese to build a massive technological self-contained city. I know you've read about this, Leon. And so these things that you're saying seem less far-fetched as time goes on.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm surprised people don't really see it. I think the big problem with the end of the world is people's personal perception and people's personal beliefs and people's personal realities. And so as the world is changing, it's not just external. You know, it's not just going to be a war or an earthquake or this or that that's going to make people wake up and change. It's stuff happening inside people right now.
Surely,
and that's
yeah.
why so many people are in so much crisis.